Check. Cek, cek. Cek 1.
Let's give a big hand to.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to FPCI Town Hall on Climate Diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, today's town hall is held in hybrid format, meaning in person and also online from our YouTube live stream. So for everybody who are attending here in person, welcome to FPCI. We're glad to have students from various universities. I heard someone's coming from Yogyakarta all the way here from Semarang, and also welcome our colleagues from climate groups and communities all across Indonesia. We would also like to welcome, for those who are tuning in from our YouTube live stream, we have over 200 registrants coming from 20 countries, over 20 countries. That includes Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, Canada, Australia, US, Rwanda, the Netherlands, Laos, Egypt, and many other countries. Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, let us give a warm welcome to our distinguished guest today, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell. And I'm sure you have known her, but if you have not, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell was the first and by far the only woman prime minister to serve as a prime minister in Canada, and she served in 1993. And the Right Honorable Kim Campbell is also the founding member of Club de Madrid, the world's largest group of heads of state and world leaders that commit to championing democracy in the world. And other than that, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell is also a member of Climate Overshoot Commission hosted by the Paris Peace Forum. Welcome, Your Right Honorable. Please give a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, we, Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, is the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. We have over 100,000 people in our network across Indonesia and throughout the world. And FBCI is also the founding member of Paris Peace Forum. Before we begin our town hall, let us first display a video about FPCI and FPCI Climate Unit. Please enjoy. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now let us begin our town hall. So for that, we would like to invite the Right Honorable Kim Campbell and our founder and chairman, Dr. Dino Patti Djalal, to come to the stage. Dr. Dino, you may take over.
I chose the most inconvenient route to get.
Good. Well, thank you very much and welcome to Indonesia. I think the second time that you are in the country.
It is indeed, and when you get older, you forget how long things have been. I think it might be almost 12 years since I was here. I chaired the global committee, global conference of the World Movement for Democracy, and had wonderful memories of being here. So I'm delighted to be back. So, hello everybody.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. And I should tell you, because you're former Prime Minister of Canada, I grew up in Canada and I studied.
Where did you grow up?
In Ottawa and Vancouver. And you're from Vancouver.
I'm from Vancouver, yes.
Yes.
We should compare if we have webbed toes. Vancouver's got a lot of rain, so we say people in Vancouver have webbed toes.
Yes, well,
Like
I mean,
ducks.
because I deal a lot with the U.S. I was ambassador to the U.S. People associate me with the U.S., but really, one of my best years in life in Canada. You know, it's a big country, very friendly people. I had a great time traveling throughout Canada, and the schools were amazing. Right? I went to some of the best schools in Canada, and the friends I developed in Canada remain friends with me today. So really, thank you, Kim.
Well, Stuart, from the Canadian Embassy, I'm sure we're all
Yes,
feeling very, very proud to hear that. Yes.
yes.
And the goals that you expressed for Indonesia, wanting to be a great, a medium power, strong medium power, maritime power, democratic power, these are all things that Canadians share too for our own country. So we're very similar hopes and goals for our country and the roles that we can play in the world.
Yes. Now, Ms. Campbell, you are a member of the Climate Overshoot Committee. Can you explain about the committee and the concept of overshoot in climate terms? Yeah.
Well, as you're well aware, there is a risk that the world may in fact overshoot the 1.5 degree Celsius warming goal that was set by the Paris Accord. And in the same way that for a long time people in the climate world didn't like to talk too much about adaptation because they feared that that would take the attention away from the need to reduce emissions, which is the highest priority. There's no other there's no other recipe for the world than to do that. In the same way, people have not wanted to discuss the possibility of overshoot and what that might mean. So the Climate Overshoot Commission was created from the Paris Peace Forum, and we're chaired by Pascal Lamy, and it involves a number of us, many of us, there actually have some sitting government members. So the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of Pakistan is a member, Hina Khan. But most of us are former presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and we have a team of scientists looking to try to define what the challenges are for overshoot and to look at some possibilities that have been suggested for certain technologies and approaches, and whether, first of all, there is any point in even looking at them, but also what might be the governance structures. Because if we get involved in, for example, geoengineering, which people talk about, there is no global system to govern, to make decisions, who can give approval for such a things, how we would evaluate whether the risks were appropriate or not. So we have a huge gap in our international governance structures and accountability structures for looking at these things. So we are trying to, I guess, think about the unthinkable. Although I also think that in looking at the challenges of overshoot and some of these other things, it simply underlines even more the importance of the fundamental goal, which is to get emissions under control. That is the only really sound goal that we should have. But recognizing that there is a risk of not meeting our goal, we need to think about what some of the other strategies might be and how we could even think about them responsibly and accountably in the context of world governance.
You know, by 2050, most of these guys, or all these guys, will be at the peak of their life. They'll have, you'll be about 50 years old, and you have 3 kids, CEOs, or maybe presidents or ministers. If we get to a world that will be, say, 3 degrees, hotter, than projected. What's the big deal? Yeah, can you explain to them why that is a undesirable outcome? Yeah.
Well, it's an undesirable outcome because it will fundamentally transform the physical nature of our planet. And as a result, it will fundamentally transform the geopolitical nature of our planet. We talk about Vancouver, which is a wonderful coastal city. And when you look at the predictions of how oceans will rise, it isn't actually like a bathtub, which will rise uniformly, because there are gravitational forces and things, so that some parts of the world, their oceans will rise more than in others. But if we reach 3 degrees, Vancouver may cease to exist. It's a coastal city. And all these wonderful cities along the coast. The state of Florida, the highest point in the state of Florida is 300 feet above sea level. So there are parts of the world, and we're seeing this in Pakistan and Bangladesh, some parts of the world that are already feeling not even from the melting ice caps and the melting of Greenland and Antarctica, what that would eventually lead to, but even from the changing weather structures that are increasing rains and creating unmanageable flooding that exceeds the ability of the earth structures to absorb flood waters. Instead of replenishing groundwater, you're simply getting terrible floods and landslides. So the transformation of the world, not just in terms of the rising sea levels, but the disappearance of the glaciers that supply the water. If you know that the Himalayas and the watersheds there supply most of Southeast Asia, these are such dramatic changes, and that what come with them are things like drought, like fires. Even my own province of British Columbia in Canada has had terrible forest fires, wildfires, and throughout and Washington State as well, where the smoke could actually be smelled in New York, in eastern Canada. These are mind-boggling situations, and of course, then the physical change, how it will affect the ability to produce food and supply our basic needs, will have huge geopolitical effects, because it will be politically very destabilizing. And when we were talking earlier about the challenges to democracy, if we think populism and disinformation on social media is a challenge of democracy, just wait until people's countries are being destroyed and low-level island states disappear. The injustice of it, given the fact that this is a phenomenon created by countries, industrial countries, but maybe more severely felt by the countries that didn't create the emissions. This is going to be a moral and political problem for the world. So not to confront it and try to take the steps necessary, and I'll say a little bit more later about some of those issues, is really tragic. And your generation is going to feel the brunt of it. My generation has failed to solve it, and I'm going to say a few reasons for that in a minute. But anyway, unless anybody thinks that climate change isn't important, that global warming isn't important, please think again. It is an existential crisis. People throw that term around. What does an existential crisis mean? It's a crisis about whether you're going to continue to exist, with your fundamental ability to exist. And this is it, folks, the existential crisis of climate change.
Would you say, thanks for that, and also our number one environmental icon, Professor Emil Salim, has said that a 3-degree world will be equal to a doomsday, not just for Indonesia and for the rest of the world. And all the big dreamy things that we envision for Indonesia will be erased in that world. But do you think the cost of adapting to a much hotter world is far higher than the cost of trying to mitigate it now? Yeah.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. there's a very interesting American magazine called The Atlantic Monthly, which I read. I get it online because it has a sort of broad variety of articles, political and social and economic. But they have very good environmental writing. And there was just an article I read in it recently, and I'm telling you the name of the magazine because I can't remember the name of the article. But it talked about some of the remarkable shifts in economic and business thinking about climate change. For a long time, climate activists, like me and others, have been arguing that, in fact, it is much less expensive to deal with climate change, that there are huge economic opportunities. But that is a message that is now starting to get through in business communities and in countries around the world, so that not only do we no longer have to rely entirely on top-down efforts made by governments, but bottom-up business entrepreneurship. People, the private sector is coming to see that there are enormous economic opportunities in creating the technologies and processes that are congenial to getting rid of emissions and making this a much healthier world. And the recent American legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, was absolutely remarkable because, again, the previous president pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accord and all this other stuff, that President Biden passed this law, which has absolutely galvanized a lot of American industry, created important incentives for green technologies and changes, and that the climate experts that I follow, are sort of amazed because they didn't expect it. But what it shows is that certain policies from a government, combined with the capacity of the private sector in a society and the ingenuity, and when you think of the richness of research, and all of you are part of societies that have smart people doing things in universities, and they're solving problems, and technical experts and engineers finding problems, and now there are the incentives to do it, and we're now seeing that, in fact, it is much more key to prosperity to tackle these issues, that we have the means, and everybody is saying we know how to do it. What we need are the social and political incentives to allow us to do it. And I think what's really important to recognize is that we have, in fact, been paying the bad guys to keep doing the bad things. That even in the United States, there are incentives, there are subsidies that go to fossil fuel industries. And if you just stopped paying those, not even give the money to other industries, just stop paying those, you would totally change the economic calculus of what it makes sense to invest in and do. Sure, if somebody's going to, what's the old saying that, we privatize the profits and we socialize the losses. If you give people an incentive to keep doing things that are detrimental to your society, don't be surprised if they do it. But there's another factor there too. And can I just sort of ramble on here for a second? Please. Because I'm a lawyer. And one of the things that I am profoundly and passionately committed to is the rule of law. Not because I think laws are perfect. I served as 3 years as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of my country, which meant I was responsible for legislating the criminal law. And these are issues that are often complicated and difficult, and trying to find ways of creating a just society and holding certain things up to accountability and creating disincentives for bad behavior. It can be complicated. I mean, it's not a simple thing, but it's very important. And having the rule of law and having justice systems that work equally for everyone, these are struggles that we create in democracies, but as a goal and as something that gives us faith in our democratic systems, it's very important. And the rule of law can be used in a lot of ways. And there was a very interesting report that recently came out from Hamburg, from a climate institute, which did a very interesting analysis of what they call climate litigation. That more and more people are using legal systems to try and hold people accountable who have been doing things and engaged in conduct that is detrimental to the climate. Now, in the law, if you're looking at the criminal law, there's a concept called mens rea, which is the mind of the thing. In other words, you can't be guilty of something if you don't know what you're doing is a crime, or you don't have the intent to do it. But we know something very interesting now. People have been writing about this for some time, but there have recently been hearings in the American Congress that the leaders of the large oil companies have known since the late 1970s what the implications of burning fossil fuels are. Their own scientists were telling them, were coming with reports and saying, here's what's going to happen if we continue burning fossil fuels. And they deliberately, first of all, shut down that science, but they also created front organizations that were ostensibly scientific organizations. And they were very smart because they didn't try to prove that climate change was non-existent. They didn't try to argue against the greenhouse gas effect of carbon dioxide, which incidentally we've known since the 19th century. This is nothing new. And actually one of the first people who did an empirical examination of this was a woman who wasn't allowed to read her paper at a scientific conference. And so a man read it and it got lost. Was it written by a woman? And 20 years later, a man did the same thing and people paid attention. But the point is, we've known for well over a century, almost 2 centuries, that carbon dioxide has that effect. But what these companies did is they created organizations that argued that climate science was uncertain. Now, if you're a politician and you want to devote money to policies that might gore a few oxen, as we say, that might annoy a few people, you really want to know that you're as certain as possible about the effects of what you're doing. And so if you have very highly funded organizations with scientists, very often scientists who are not climate scientists, telling politicians, well, don't do anything too soon, and, it might be overstated, and, it's a lot of money to do, and be very expensive, and it will be very costly and damage, then it makes it very difficult for politicians to make the decisions and create the policies that would deal with these issues. But we know about this now, and I would like to see more of these people who knew. And now it's not if you do something out of ignorance, you say, okay, that's maybe you were negligent, you should have known more, or maybe you just made mistakes. But if you know that what you're doing is having that effect, why shouldn't you be held legally accountable? And I think we should, as countries with the rule of law, use our rule of law, or at the very least, give notice to people. You're going to be held accountable. We are going to, I would love to see, an international sort of criminal court on climate change to bring in all these people who have deliberate. But when you think about it, it makes my blood run cold when I think about how hard it is to make policy, how hard it is to engage in political reform in a democratic society, because you've got to try and get people's support. And nowadays, with disinformation and social media, how hard it is to create the kind of consensus that governments need to make wise policy. And that there have been people deliberately, for no other motivation but greed, have deliberately obfuscated the facts and made it very difficult for citizens to know what they should be expecting from their governments and for governments to be able to deliver. So there are a lot of different strategies that we can use to think about these things, but I think holding people accountable now for what we're deliberate, if somebody deliberately did something to defraud you, took away your life savings, wouldn't you feel you had a right to recourse under the law? Well, these are people who are defrauding you of your future, of the future of this planet, of your right to have a planet that is healthy, and where the things that we've created and the human civilizations that we have created are not under threat because of changing global positions and realities. So anyway, I throw that out to you for any of you burgeoning young lawyers who want to get organized and jump on that. People are doing that. People are suing. They're suing governments, they're suing cities. Because what happens is if people know they're going to have to pay a price, they recalibrate their behavior. If I know I'm going to get away with something, I don't know what the leaders of these big oil companies tell their grandchildren. I honestly don't know. Do they go with Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever holidays they celebrate together, or birthdays, and the grandchild says, Grandpa, is it really true that, fossil fuels are going to destroy our planet? And Grandpa, who has made his fortune from selling fossil fuels, says, oh, well, no, it's all over exaggerated.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do they say?
I think this leads to at least two issues that would prevent climate security in the future. One is that all the things that we do to decarbonize are great, but it seems to me, Ms. Campbell, it seems to me they are incremental and not enough to deliver this huge transformational change that you talk about. It's not revolutionary enough. It's just a lot of small and mid-level things that I fear are not gonna bring us to the 1.5 degree world. And the second problem is, I think I get in many, or if not most Western countries, climate issue is national political issues, right? I think it's that way in Sweden, in Norway, perhaps in Canada. But outside the Western world, including in Indonesia, climate policy is still top-bottom, in the sense that there's, in the national elections, candidates for national leaders are not called to demonstrate their climate policy credibility, right? So how do we move that needle? Yeah.
Well, first of all, we keep your organization going.
Yes, we're trying our best.
no.
Sometimes it's lonely for us, to be honest. Yeah.
Yes, and so every one of you who is here and is listening, you are part of a solution to that, because each one of your brains that takes on the challenge of learning about this issue and understanding what it means to your country, you can be part of the process to try and create that accountability. And it doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight, but you also have to tell your parents and your grandparents that this is an issue that, most of our grandparents want their grandchildren to have good lives. They work hard. Sometimes they hope to leave them a little bit of money, and they hope they give them their wisdom. And the last thing they want to think of is that their darling little grandchildren are going to live in a very inhospitable world, both physically in terms of the geography and politically because of the social disruption that will come from the costs of climate change. So this is something that young people can learn about, but also try to mobilize their families about and get them to understand. And I think the important thing is, you see, I blame people who know better, but I also realize that there are a lot of people who believed that it wasn't a big deal, who were persuaded, who see these things on social media, don't have, they're busy living their lives. They don't necessarily have time to get into the details. So I think what's really important is to say, it's not your fault that there's climate change, in the sense that, you grew up in a world where there was the internal combustion engine and driving a car. And I think you can't really say to your parents and your grandparents, you were morally a failure because you drove a car. But to say, but now we know, and we can make the changes that it's possible for us to make. And you're quite right that we're falling behind the goals that we've set. But there also seem to be some interesting kind of quantum leaps that we make. And as I say, this article in The Atlantic, what was so interesting was its comment about how surprising it was at how quickly there have been responses, and that the market realities of climate positive technologies have suddenly overtaken many economic circumstances. So now we have to say is, okay, how do we get ourselves off fossil fuels, and how do we help that transition? Very interesting. Russia invades Ukraine, and Europe foolishly allowed itself to become energy dependent on Russia, which incidentally was the best example ever, that they had no negative views about Russia. They wanted Russia to succeed and were prepared to integrate their energy systems. I mean, if that's not a peaceful a reflection of a peaceful intention, I don't know what is. You would certainly not integrate your energy system with a country that you thought you wanted to be hostile to. But they did this. And so when Russia invaded Ukraine, and people thought, oh dear, the Europeans will have to succumb to blackmail and not push back on Russia, even though they think what Russia is doing is terrible and criminal, because they'll be stuck using Russian gas. No. They, in fact, stopped using Russian gas, they're going to, and they're trying to make more punishments. And then people said, well, they're going to stop using Russian gas, they're going to go back using more coal. Initially, there did seem to be a slight increase in use of coal, but then two things happened. One, alternate sources of natural gas were found, which are less damaging than coal. They're not a long-term fuel, but in the short term, they're okay. And the Europeans have moved more to alternative energy. In other words, surprise, surprise, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has turned out to speed up the transition in Europe to alternative energies. Who'd have thunk it? I wouldn't have predicted it. But that's what's happened. And it may be because there is an underlying sense of reality in Europe about what needs to be done. Maybe because the level of the technology is making it possible to do this now, that the capacities of solar power and wind power are much greater than they used to be. I don't know the answers because I'm sure it's probably a bunch of small decisions made in a bunch of different countries. But nobody would have imagined that. And it's turned out to be, a hugely unexpected benefit. So things like this, like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, who would have thought it? The fact that President Biden was able to get it through before the Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives. A huge and unexpected legislative victory that is turning out to be very, very good for climate policy in a country that is very much a leader and where we look to it. If the United States isn't doing it, that's why when President Trump pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, it was so devastating. So you're quite right, and that's why our Climate Overshoot Commission, we are thinking about the unthinkable. We are trying, and one of the things we want to do is to be able to map out what overshoot means, because we think that, if anything, should even reinforce people's commitments to meet the goal, meet the target. Because there isn't, what people say, there isn't a plan B, there isn't a planet B. There's only this planet. And, maybe sometimes we actually need to be face to face with catastrophe to recognize that it's in our power to do something about it. But I think also the one thing about, young people is it's worth thinking about. It's worth all of us thinking about. We cannot solve the problem individually alone. We have to act collectively in a lot of ways. But there are a lot of things individually we can do. And if we do all of the things that we can do, for example, the COP15 in Montreal on biodiversity, one of the things it committed to was reducing food waste, I think by 50% in the world. And food waste, aside from the fact that it in the long run, it poses a threat to global nutrition and survival, it's also climate negative. So when you focus on something like avoiding food waste, you are actually doing something good for the climate because you're creating things that will produce methane and all sorts of nasty things. So I think as individuals, we can find ways of living our lives that are more consistent with a healthy planet, with reducing our own personal emissions. And it's not the answer to the whole problem, but I think it gives us a sense of empowerment. And one of the hard things when you're facing difficult circumstances is not to despair and not to throw your hands up and say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. There are things we can do about it as part of collectives, and there are things that we can do about it individually. And by living our lives according to those principles and learning, looking up and figuring out things that we can do and sharing it with our friends, we also then can perhaps create the sort of tsunami of activity where it becomes something that is done at such a scale that it really does make a very measurable difference. So don't underestimate the capacity of your own good brains and your own ability to learn how to do stuff and to make small changes in your lives, not, dramatic changes in your lives. I mean, dramatic is great if you can do it, but even making small changes in your lives can help to make you part of the solution. And I was saying before we started that when we created the Club of Madrid, which is the largest forum of former Democratic presidents and prime ministers, we all said, we don't think we can save the world, but we can be a tile in the mosaic of progress. And when you think about it, good things happen by many, many individual decisions. And that's what they're finding, for example, in the United States as a result of that legislation, that individual businesses are making decisions and individual people are saying, aha, I could now do this, or I could create this technology, I could be a part of this market. And that adds up to something very measurable. So being a tile in the mosaic of progress is pretty good, because if you ever see a mosaic and there's a tile missing, it doesn't look so good.
I like that analogy. I'm going to take two questions from the audience. Can I see some hands? Okay. Yeah. Please identify yourself and institution, and then anyone else? Anyone? Okay. Gentleman from Central Java. You can bisa berdiri di sini. You can step up. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Irene. I'm from Gadjah Mada University, Yogyakarta. And my question is, for the global South countries who are kind of depending on non-renewable companies as the national income, how can we manage the cost to change it into something that is eco-friendly? You said that, maybe the young people can also make changes, but if the young people making changes with this little by little, when will the changes can be seen for the global scope? I do believe and optimistic about this, and but is it going to be too late if we're waiting for only the young people who are making changes, and especially once again for the global South countries like Indonesia? Thank you.
Okay, next question. Let's take the second question. By the way, Arlene is coming from university. That's about 12 hours drive away. Is it 12 hours?
12 hours with train.
With train?
Yeah.
Okay. With car, maybe that's 18 hours or less. Yeah, okay.
Am I audible? Okay. So my next question is
Identify yourself, please.
oh yeah. So my name is Hazel Naila. I am from University of Diponegoro in Central Java or in Semarang.
How far away is that?
Maybe like 8 hours from here.
8 hours driving.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So my question is regarding what are your thoughts on how the West can use green diplomacy to influence Indonesian energy consumption that's still extensively reliant on fossil fuels and coals. As of 2020, fossil fuels provided 86% of Indonesian electricity. Indonesian growth is in renewable energy is still significantly lower, and our hope toward renewable energy is still low also. Thank you.
I'm just going to allow for one round, so I would rather, because Ms. Campbell has the next appointment. Does anyone else want to ask a question while we have? Okay, can you step up? Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. I want to ask about... okay. My name is Corny. I come from Bakri University. So I want to ask about... my friend and I always talk about the impact of climate change from the fossil fuels perspective. And we see some of the company that you say in the United States always making a statement like denial. And a lot of us like thinks that we don't have power to generate the society to be really understanding about what is the impact of the climate change itself. In your perspective, what you suggest us to do to make people will be aware more and could be pushing the government to make better policies, because we know that Indonesian government itself trying to be balancing about the investment and also about the climate change, but mostly we see that the government is try to pushing the fossil fuels agenda, something like that. Thank you.
Well, there's a kind of similarity in the questions, and just to say that relative to your own country, and I think there are oil resources here that are used. In Canada, we are also an economy that still has a big oil industry, the oil sands industry in Alberta, and it's politically very sensitive. And I think that slowly things are changing. but I think there's been a lot of, I think, weakness on the part of leaders, because the important thing, just let me say that several years ago I was creating a program at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, which is the heart of the oil industry. And I was asked to go and speak to the global leadership group of one of the big oil companies in Canada. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I said to them, climate change is real, and we're going to have to get off fossil fuels, but I don't think you should shut down tomorrow. I said, but you need to take it seriously, and you should be thinking what kind of companies you are. Are you an oil company or are you an energy company? What is your infrastructure? What are your skills? What are your resources? How could you use the income you're making now to change your activities, to invest in other areas of economic activity, perhaps other energy resources that would enable you to continue to make value for your shareholders, instead of suddenly finding yourself in the position of being a mothballed industry with nothing to show for it. So, for example, there is one city in Alberta, the Hinton, Alberta, that had 17 oil wells around it. These were not oil sands oil wells, these were more traditional oil wells. And they have used those deep structures to create geothermal energy plants. So I'm not saying that there's an easy transition between the oil infrastructure and renewable energy infrastructures, but there are some opportunities. There are also some opportunities to use resources to reinvest in new things, because I think this part of the world is probably very well. I just noticed the wind blowing today. You could probably do a lot of wind energy here, solar energy. I mean, there are ways in which you can transform, and the cost of this infrastructure is getting lower and lower. Even hydrogen, creating green as opposed to blue hydrogen. I mean, there's a whole lot of things, but you need a strategy. But the problem is, if governments are subsidizing the oil industry, then that's a problem, because you're distorting the economic impact of it. So I'm not trying to suggest that it's easy, like, okay, I mean, I drove over here, and the one thing I remember about Jakarta is the traffic, and that's a lot of, oil burning cars driving around, and that people here rely on them, and even the little motorbikes that people use. I mean, they're not, transforming your transportation infrastructure into non carbon dioxide producing forms is not something that happens overnight, but you need to have a strategy and a plan, and you certainly need to make the economic incentives favorable to those changes. And I think, again, the only answer for countries like Indonesia and my own country, I mean, many Canadians thought that, well, global warming will come and we'll grow oranges in Saskatchewan. Ha, ha, ha. Won't that be fine? This cold country will now be a world warm country. Well, no, what we're finding is that a new term I'd never heard before, atmospheric river. Have you ever heard of that term? Yeah. Well, that's when you have enormous waves of water coming in the sky and creating terrible flooding. Well, I'd never heard that as part of a Canadian weather report until recently. Wildfires, destroying the very forests that are necessary to absorb the carbon to deal with climate change. So all of a sudden, many Canadians who thought they were going to escape, and the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, there was a heat dome in Washington State and British Columbia that created unprecedented high temperatures that were killing people, because that's a temperate area where people are not equipped. I grew up, who had air conditioning in Vancouver? You just opened the window, because it wasn't that kind of a climate. Now we need that. So the realities of what it means are coming home to more people. And you're an island country. And the reality of what it's going to mean if Greenland melts, if the Antarctic ice sheet melts, it's going to mean your communities are seriously under threat. So it's without terrifying people so they just want to, kill themselves, but by making people realize the reality of the threat, but also providing strategies. That's the thing. You have to have a positive thing. Bill Clinton was involved in the Club of Madrid, and I've heard him speak many times. And he's a character, but one of the things that I think makes him such an effective speaker is that whenever he talks about something like global warming, he always tries to give people in the audience something that they could do, so that people don't feel in despair. They feel worried and informed about a threat, but they also feel empowered. And I think that is what's really important, is to empower yourself with the knowledge and take the threat very seriously, but to understand that we actually have the knowledge and resources we need to deal with this. What we need is the political and social will to implement it. So seeing yourself as being part of that social and political campaign of raising awareness and helping your people become the constituency for good policy is what will also stimulate the development of the alternative policies that will help you transform your energy system. And I'm quite sure you know better than I what would be an appropriate approach for Indonesia.
By the way, you're from Vancouver. I think last year you had a heat wave that was crazy. Was it 50 degrees Celsius?
Yeah, that was what they called the heat dome. It was like a dome of heat over the whole Pacific Northwest, Vancouver and northern Washington state. Who ever heard of such a thing in Vancouver? You've been there.
Yes. Yeah.
Temperate Vancouver. You know, I said we're the banana belt of Vancouver. You know, we don't get cold winters and we don't get hot summers. It's always livable, except for last summer.
Yeah. So for all of you, you've never, I bet you've never lived in 50-degree weather. And what it means is, if you go outside for 5 minutes, you start losing your breath. You can't jog. You can't walk your dog outside. You can't do anything, right? I remember I was in Perth, I think 4 or 5 years ago, and the weather was about 40 degrees. I really couldn't breathe right when I stepped outside the door. So imagine living like that permanently, right? So that's what we're talking about.
It's not consistent with human life unless you create artificial atmospheres inside. But even so, we can't survive. We can't grow our food. We can't live that way. And so it's when people talk about an existential threat, that's what they're talking about, the existence of human. The planet will survive in whatever terrible things we do to it. It'll still be this little blue ball revolving around the sun. But whether human beings will be living and thriving on it will be another question.
And the mental challenge for this, Ms. Campbell, is in Indonesia and in many places around the world, people have to die first and suffer first before we get convinced there's a problem. Instead of saying, okay, there's going to be a problem, let's act on it now, right? So that's the challenge, because I'm not going to be around 2050 when the world gets to be 2 or 3 degree world. You're going to be owning that world, right? So this is your problem as much as our problem today. There's a question from, by the way, we just found out that watch is 10 minutes late, right? So we have a problem we have a question from Arinatil and YouTube. How do we establish a regional agreement for climate resilience? And as we know, Southeast Asia will be one of the most impacted by the climate crisis.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not involved in your regional developments, although there's, ASEAN is meeting here, I think this month. The regional developments will come from the pressures on the governments to create them. And regional cooperation is often, it helps resources to be used effectively and efficiently, and for cooperation and sharing best practices and innovative techniques, etc. So I think that people have to push for that to be a high priority agenda. And that sense of shared commitment can be very important. But we've already had the Paris Accord, where many countries have signed on. We have the COP15 on biodiversity. In other words, there are a lot of global agreements and conventions, and now we have to translate those into the actual practical hands-on policies to do. But I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, because I'm not in the position to do it. But I do believe so strongly that you need to create constituencies for good policy, and that means informed, vocal publics who can call people out, but that can also help politicians and policymakers feel that there are answers, that there are resources, that there are intelligent and economically positive approaches to dealing with these issues. That because for a long time the message was, oh, it's just so expensive to deal with climate change. And the first, like the Nicholas Stern report in Britain in I think 2004, thought that it would be expensive, but it'd be more expensive not to do it. But now, as we move along, we see that there are actually economically positive approaches to dealing with climate change that actually give you a much better economic growth and development, and more equally shared, and more long-term, more sustainable than people thought even 20 years ago. So the advantage of this is that our thinking gets better as we continue to deal with the problem. So in terms of what we're capable of doing, we shouldn't despair. In terms of what we are doing, we may feel a little desperate.
Maybe a last question for me, Kim. I know you touched on this a little bit. What do you think would be the most realistic game-changing technologies, climate technologies that we should expect to grow in the next 10 years or 20 years? I mean, for example, is hydrogen, is there much potential in hydrogen? Because now it's just still too expensive. Or other technologies that you think would be a game changer in the next 10 years? Yeah.
Well, there are, well, it's interesting with hydrogen. It depends on where you are and what energy you use to create it, whether it's blue or green, and how you transport it. And I think, isn't it hydrogen that they turn into ammonia to transport on ships and things? And I'm wondering if some of the pipelines we have might safely be used. I don't know if they're safe to transport ammonia. So hydrogen is something that I wouldn't rule out, but it has its downsides. But when we look at things like wind technology now, they're building in Britain and other places. They're building wind farms that are very far offshore, with huge wind turbines, so that you don't see them. They don't spoil people's view, but they're very, very effective. It's interesting. In parts in northern England, there were some cities, or maybe it was even in Scotland. It was up on that coast up there anyway, Scotland, I think, where people had been getting jobs on the North Sea oil platforms. And now they are getting the jobs on the wind farms instead. And they're much happier because they didn't have to be away from home so much. So they were getting the same kind of high-paid jobs because similar skills were needed. Unfortunately, the wind farms that are farther out also now require them to be away from home about the same amount of time as they were on the oil platforms. But there is that workforce. The point is that there were translatable skills, that the same skills that people had in managing all the technologies on an oil drilling platform could be used to work to install and maintain these huge wind turbines, which are extraordinary. And I don't understand the physics of it and all these funny things with these little thin arms, but they do appear to be quite remarkable. Similarly, the power of solar cells, it gets better and better and better. Incidentally, one of the biggest solar arrays in North America is just outside Calgary, of all places. As we realize, you don't have to have heat to have solar power. You have to have sun. And it doesn't even have to be direct sun, but we're getting so much more effective. And now people are creating things that look like glass, that you can actually make windows that could be solar batteries, create solar power. Sorry, solar receptors to create solar batteries. There's all sorts of things as the incentives are there. Things that you could use as just covers on buildings. Kind of like a form of paint or something that are photovoltaic. In other words, the more we understand this and the more we develop the ability to store this kind of energy, the more incentives there are to create it. So I think we are, we're really, in some ways, in early days of that. But I think at the moment, wind and solar are very important. There are some people who still think that nuclear power is good. The downsides, I wouldn't like to see us get into huge nuclear power development, but if we have current existing nuclear power plants that can be operated safely while we're waiting to transition, they certainly are emissions free that way. Even hydroelectric power, which is, people don't like it for some reasons. We got lots of it in British Columbia, but if you have existing hydroelectric facilities, and certainly to continue to use them while they're still environmentally safe, until you can come to other things. Nuclear fusion, we just had a little experiment which required power in a nanosecond, it's a long way from being anywhere near something that could create widespread energy. But those who are keen on it, here's hoping they keep working on it, and maybe by the time you guys are my age, nuclear fusion will become the new cheap, universally available form of energy. But we have to get there, and what we have to realize is today we can't have pie in the sky, but we have good things today. We don't have to dream. We've got workable technologies, and maybe someday they'll come to the end of their utility and we will replace them with others. But one of the things we're likely to need is some forms of electrical transmission, and that's one of the areas that's a problem, is transmission grids are underdeveloped in many places. We may be able to develop forms of electricity where you just stick something on top of your house and you don't have to be part of a grid and it'll just fire up your whole house. I don't know. But there are some aspects of the earlier forms of energy, the distribution and the grids and things, that are translatable into other sources of electricity. So, it's not a matter of something becoming totally useless and has to be replaced by something else. We'll gradually evolve into new ways of doing things that are more, that are easier and less expensive. But we have the technology now to make the transitions that we need to make. And we need to use those existing technologies, because using them will provide even greater incentive to perfect them and make them even more efficient.
Okay. Can you take one more question? Question from Stevie Hansen. Is it from YouTube? YouTube. Okay. What do you think about the geopolitical tensions and its cost to net zero progress?
Well, I think the geopolitical tensions from not moving towards net zero are going to be a lot greater than the geopolitical tensions that we have. And yes, they're real. And that is why I thought what was one of the good things that came out of COP27 was a greater focus on climate justice. The expression has just gone out of my head. The investment in helping countries make transitions and to adapt. I think we're coming to a much better sense that, yes, those of us who come from countries that have been the big emitters and have been contributing to this, we have a moral obligation to help meet the costs of those countries that are so terribly affected by climate change. So I think we have to, be grown-ups and be responsible, and in my part of the world. But I think that if we don't, the anger and despair that will come in countries if we are not helping people to deal with this and dealing with the fundamental problem will eclipse anything that we think of now. If we think we have disruption, and I don't even want to give examples because I don't want to give anybody ideas of bad things to do, but there are a lot of bad things people can do around the world when they're mad at you, and when they are mad at you for good reason, because being faced with the consequences of what you've done, even if you haven't done it deliberately to be a bad person or a bad country, but being faced with the consequences and not taking responsibility for them, and recognizing that you need to help mitigate those consequences as they affect other parts of the world who weren't part of the problem, I think that is, if you don't do that, that is a recipe for absolute disaster, chaos, and disorder. And nobody deserves that. And we're all capable. We have the technology to deal with the energy issue, and we have the wisdom and knowledge to deal with the moral questions. And if we don't, that would be inexcusable.
Well, let's give a big hand to Ibu Kim Campbell.
I just want to say that I love seeing you all, and to all of you who are coming to us via technology. And isn't that a wonderful thing? Although the only thing, the problem with learning to do Zoom is evidently giving plastic surgeons lots of business, because a lot of people who've spent all of COVID looking at their faces on Zoom decided they didn't like what they saw. I wanted to change it. So when I'm on Zoom, I like not to look at myself if I can avoid it. But it is wonderful that we can communicate in real time with a little bit of the nuance of how we're speaking and saying things. So thank you so much. But you also, you give me a lot of hope because you're smart and you care enough to come and hear about this and to think about it. So anyway, consider yourselves hugged. You're all wonderful.
And thank you. Big hand to Ibu. And the last time Canada had a woman prime minister was 30 years ago. I want to remind you, and I think it shouldn't be. That's way too long for. Yeah. So I hope we'll see more women in Canada's leadership. And I want to announce to you that FPCI is running a campaign. There's something called Generation Y, right? And there's something called Generation Z, right? We're gonna launch a new concept, which is Generation NZ, right? Generation Net Zero. And I want to ask all of you to be the warrior, the champion of this, because again, you got to be scared, right? Because the option of a 4 or 3 degree world is just a nightmare. But you got to own it. Own it means you got to care enough to do everything you can to avoid that 3 or 4 degree world, right? So be scared, but own the future and change it. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I want to give you just a little time just to mingle, and you want to take a selfie or pictures with Ms. Campbell. Are you most welcome? Yeah.
But Ms. Campbell, before we take a picture, just one more announcement to make. Prime Minister said that we can be part of the political and social campaign. So FPCI is entering its 3rd year in having its petition, and we encourage everybody here to also be part of the petition by going to change.org/darurat iklim. Darurat iklim. Everybody who are tuning in YouTube too, change.org/darurat iklim. Yes, you can grab your phone. It only takes a minute of your time. Yes. But Ms. Campbell, we're going to take a picture, and there is a gift that you will be giving to Ms. Campbell. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a gift from us, and you can open it and see what it is.
Oh, I've been envying his teacher. And it looks like it's my size. Oh, lovely. Hero be a zero. Isn't that a great slogan? I will wear it with pride. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Give a big hand.
Thank you very much once again, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, for attending and being here in FPCI.
Can we have some of the student representatives?
It's a rare chance. Okay. Everybody just squeeze in to the center. You can go up to the stage as well, so your face can be seen on the camera. Yep. Okay. Yang di depan boleh pada jongkok aja. Okay. It's okay. Cameraman? Okay. In the count of 3. Okay. Oh, yang di ujung kiri, ayo. Okay, in the count of 3. Okay. Sebelah kiri, squeeze in.
By the way, sorry, do you mind just taking this aside all the way?
Okay.
Sorry, one more. So this is our net zero salam 1.5. So 1.5 degree.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. You can rewatch this town hall in our YouTube channel, Secretariat FPCI. Don't forget to share your moments with us. Check our Twitter and Instagram at FPCindo.